tens of millions of dollars in taxpayer money, which was supposed to help fight poverty in Mississippi, was misspent and stolen. Joining me today is a man who's done perhaps more than anyone else to uncover this here in Mississippi, Shad White, the state auditor. Thank you for coming in.
Yeah, thank you for having me, man. I appreciate it.
So you've written a book, Mississippi Swindle,
Yeah.
and it tells a really extraordinary tale. It talks about how tens of millions of dollars of taxpayer money that was supposed to be used to fight poverty and provide welfare in Mississippi ended up in the pockets of people who spent it on themselves. Tell us a little bit about this.
Sure. Yeah, so going back, I guess, to the beginning of the story, and this is the first chapter in the book, too. Back in the summer of 2019, my office received a tip that suggested that the head of a state agency in Mississippi, the Department of Human Services, may be getting a kickback from one of its vendors. And in Mississippi, the Department of Human Services, DHS, handles our welfare money, so temporary assistance for needy families, which is commonly known as welfare. We, based on that tip, launched a criminal investigation and did a big audit in the back half of 2019 and early 2020. And what we found, unfortunately, is exactly what you just said, Douglas. Really, once we added it all up, north of $100 million of welfare funds had been misspent. And when I say misspent, I mean spent on things that are not allowable expenditures for welfare funds. So sponsorships for beauty pageants, advertisements at college bowl games outside of Mississippi, donations to other charitable organizations where there was no proof that the money was helping poor people. And then on top of that, money that had been misspent, there were millions of dollars that just got taken by fraud. And so based on that finding, prosecutors have indicted multiple individuals. Multiple individuals have now, 4 years later, pleaded guilty to either state or federal charges. And unfortunately, when you look back at it all, it's now the largest public fraud scheme in the history of the state of Mississippi.
Of the roughly $100 million we're talking about, roughly what portion was, if you like, misspent, people spending it on dumb things, and what portion of it was actual fraud?
If you look back at the indictments and the guilty pleas, when you start adding those dollars up, you're talking about $8–10 million that you could argue were taken as a result of fraud, but then many, many more millions of dollars, obviously, just lit on fire, basically. They did nothing to help poor people in Mississippi.
How can, a lot of people watching this might think, how do you end up like this? What was the model? What happened?
Well, it's basically a pay-to-play model. That's what we discovered. So you had the head of a state agency, John Davis, and he had started pushing big grants of TANF funds to two nonprofits in particular. And one of those nonprofits was run by a woman named Nancy New. And after several years, what you start to see is that big dollars, big welfare dollars, would go from the agency to that nonprofit. John Davis would then make certain requests of the nonprofit and say, now that I've given you this money, I'd like you to spend some of that money on X. And X oftentimes was something that was illegal. So, for instance, he wanted Nancy to spend money on drug treatment for one of John's friends named Brett DiBiase at a luxury resort treatment facility in Malibu. That's obviously not something that you can spend welfare money under the law, but that's what they would do. He'd give them big grants and then say, spend the money on that. Well, over time, it became clear that Nancy and Zach New, who were running this nonprofit, seem to realize that nobody's watching this money, that nobody is monitoring what they're doing with it, and so they end up spending some of the money to benefit themselves too. So Nancy spends government money to buy herself a house, they buy cars, they buy technology, they spend a lot of money on things that you're not allowed to spend money on. It also benefits them personally. So that's the basic model. And what I would say, just as a close to that, this is not just happening in Mississippi. This program nationally is vulnerable to this kind of fraud everywhere. In fact, a lot of programs that are supposed to help poor people are vulnerable to this kind of fraud. For example, in Minnesota, there's a massive $250 million fraud scheme involving a nonprofit that was given large government grants, and the idea behind the grant was feeding children. And you may have read about this in national news because Governor Walz in Minnesota was governor at the time. This is another example of the exact same kind of mechanism that happened down here in Mississippi. So part of the purpose of the book is telling people how this fraud happened here in Mississippi so that it ideally will not happen anywhere else again.
I see it's a bestseller. It's a bestseller in Mississippi and nationally.
We'll see. Right now, according to the Clarion Ledger, it's the most bought book in Mississippi. So that was really my goal, to be honest with you. My goal was
Some of your opponents are doing a great job in helping sell it.
apparently so. Apparently so. My goal was to tell the truth in the book and write it with the hope that Mississippians would read it, that they would read it and understand what happened to their taxpayer money.
One of the things I find really shocking about the book, it's not just, you get bad people who do bad things, and, there's also something slightly, dare I say, pathetic when you realize that there are people who probably didn't start off as bad, but they saw there was an opportunity, they thought other people are doing this, and, you can see how human nature being what it is, they ended up doing things that in the cold light of day are totally indefensible. But that's not really what's compelling about this. What's really compelling about it is how people who should have known better, people who should have been alert to this, seem to be asleep to this. Is this a specifically Mississippi problem, that people turn a blind eye to wrongdoing because they happen to go to church with someone, or they happen to know someone, or they don't want to ruffle feathers?
I don't know if it's a specifically Mississippi problem. My sense is that the problem is really acute here because we're a small state. A lot of the people who run state agencies or who are lobbyists or whatever, they all kind of know one another here in Jackson. And so if you see somebody at church or you see them at the PTO meeting, you may just assume that they're a good person. And one of the morals of this book is that you should not assume that. You should, especially if somebody's handling large pools of taxpayer funds and the money is going to places that are inexplicable and they can't tell you what they're doing with those funds, or they can't show any outcomes, maybe you ought to ask questions regardless of whether you're going to see them at church on Sunday. And I really ran into this after we uncovered this case. So we uncovered the case, we took our file over to the FBI, and they started their own investigation. We took our file to the local DA, and they indicted 6 individuals initially. We arrested those individuals based on their indictment. And then the Sunday after we did those arrests, we made those arrests, I was at church here in Jackson, and we were kind of cleaning up at the end of the church service, and the organ's playing, and I'm gathering up my daughter's stuff. At the time, we had one daughter. And a woman in the pew in front of me turned to me and said, you're the state auditor. I said, yes, ma'am. You're Shad White. I said, yes, ma'am. And she said, I saw all those arrests this week, and you need to know that you're wrong. And she turned around and walked off. And I thought, that's frustrating to hear somebody engage with you that way, but at the same time, it lets you know that even if folks are going to get their feelings hurt when they hear the truth is still important. And my job is to protect that woman's taxpayer dollars, whether she likes me telling the truth about it or not. And so if you're not willing to do that, if you're not willing to tell people hard truths, then you need to find a different job. You can't be state auditor.
I mean, the woman who did that is probably not a bad person, but it's the mindset of, I know this person, therefore I'm going to overlook their wrongdoing.
Yep.
That's kind of what probably got a lot of these people into the mess in the first place.
I think that's right. And too much trust. Too much trust in people that you've given a lot of money to. There's a reason why we have all these rules set up to monitor taxpayer funds. We have rules that say that if you're gonna give a lot of money to a nonprofit, staff need to be monitoring that nonprofit to see how they're spending money, and that wasn't happening.
I mean, it's also basic common sense. You've got any scenario where you're handing out taxpayer money, the person making the decision as to who gets it needs to be separate from the person checking to make sure it's spent the right way. Basic fiduciary duties are being ignored.
We call those segregation of duties in complicated accounting speak. And the truth is that that's a critical element to make sure that no one person has too much power over funds. The challenge is, in any white-collar fraud case, if you get multiple people conspiring together to commit fraud, especially if those people are supposed to check one another and make sure that they're doing the right thing, that's when a fraud scheme can become really expensive for the victims and can last a really long time.
Now, you took the right decision. Clearly in the book, there are moments where you do feel under pressure, but you make the right decision. How difficult was that for you personally? Were there times when you thought, I'm completely on my own here?
It was very difficult, yeah. And I think that some decisions were tough. Most of the decisions were really just common sense decisions, and the tough part was dealing with people second guessing you after the fact. So, for example, we in December of 2019, we're concluding our investigation. We're kind of rounding some things out. We still have a few more facts to dig up. And around that same time, we see that DHS, the Department of Human Services, is about to stroke another giant check to Nancy News nonprofit. And so we think, all right, we have to do something about this, and we're going to have to come forward with our findings. We can't ever arrest anybody without having a prosecutor indict that person first. So I decided, you know what, we're going to give everything that we have over to the federal authorities, but for the purposes of this case and putting a stop to the flow of funds, we're going to take our findings also to the local DA. And typically local DAs are faster at indicting individuals. My experience with federal authorities is they often take what you give them and they say, thank you very much. You'll hear from us when you hear from us, and maybe they come back 2 years later, they've redone your work, and maybe then they're ready to indict somebody. So we took it to the local DA and also gave it to the FBI. Local DA indicts 6 individuals, and that cut off the flow of funds in February of 2020, just 2 months later. So those are calls that, in hindsight, are just basic common sense calls. That's what you do. If we had done anything else, millions of additional dollars would have gone out the door. I probably would not be state auditor right now because the public criticism would be you could have just taken this to both the FBI and the local DA, and you didn't, and you cost the state millions of dollars. So really, I think that the decisions in the book were often common sense decisions. It's just dealing with people second guessing you after the fact, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, was to answer those questions.
I mean, in a sense, it's the staple theme of pretty much every Hollywood movie on crime, the tension between the federal agency and the local law enforcement agency, and that kind of comes across. So, I don't judge too harshly the fact that there's that inevitable tension between who has jurisdiction in the book. What do you think Mississippi needs to do in terms of learning from this? It's not just a few bad apples. I would say there's a problem with the system. The power of patronage in Mississippi, particularly the appointments that, and I'm not criticizing any one governor, but governors over the past decade or so have tremendous power to appoint people to organizations, to run state agencies, to run various boards. Do you think that perhaps we've not always seen people with the character needed to be independent-minded appointed to positions? And sometimes there's been a little bit of, what's the phrase? Go along to get along.
I sort of think about it the opposite way. I think, you're going to have people who are going to run big, important state agencies. So you got to have those people placed in those roles some sort of way, and having a governor appoint them is a fine enough way to do that. My takeaway is that we need to have sufficient checks and balances in place to monitor those people. So one thing I proposed after all of this in the wake of the welfare scandal is I think we need an inspector general in the state of Mississippi.
Okay.
So that's a bit different than the auditor's office. Georgia, for example, has a state auditor but also has an inspector general.
Right.
Inspector generals are designed to get into the gears of agencies while they're spending money, sometimes before they even cut checks, and investigate what's going on, and ideally put a stop to fraud or misspending before it happens or as it happens, not as an audit and an autopsy.
So if you had an inspector general, they would have come along and said, hey, this department actually needs a process in place so that if you're going to be cutting checks to non-profits, there's some process of competition, there's some process of accountability.
That is the idea, and I'll give you an example straight from Georgia. There's an inspector general in Georgia. He highlighted a program that was about to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars of taxpayer money. This was this past year. Before they even cut the first check, he comes in and he says, wait a minute, there are no internal controls in place, there are no mechanisms to make sure this program works well. And put a stop to the checks flowing out the door before they ever do. Now, later on, I think the end recipient who was about to get that money ends up getting indicted for different things. But that's the role of an inspector general, is to watch those folks who get appointed to these boards, commissions, and state agencies. That, to me, is the right way to think about how to change our system to prevent this.
Well, it's interesting because Speaker Jason White is talking now about slightly re-engineering some of the bureaucracy in the state. Maybe this is the time to do it, as well as reducing the amount of bureaucracy at a state level, creating new processes. Maybe it's a timely
Absolutely.
conversation.
Absolutely, and I think another piece of this conversation is we need to start talking about consolidating and shutting down small state agencies, boards, and commissions, or at minimum, taking some of those back office functions and putting them in a centralized place where there can be more eyeballs watching it. Fraud is the same across the entire country statistically. If you're working in a small organization, it is more likely to fall victim to fraud. And if you're working in an organization with less than 100 employees, the individual instances of fraud are more likely to cost more money than if you're in a big organization.
Right. It's just you need the structures, corporate structures in place.
Absolutely. More eyeballs, more internal accountants, more lawyers looking at stuff, the less likely the fraud. And so I think we have way too many small boards and commissions doing their own thing in Mississippi. I think we should consolidate a lot of the back office functions in one place.
Now, of course, Mississippi still has a real problem of poverty. And a need to look at what can be done to reduce poverty. Now, I know that you, like many people, are interested in the so-called success sequence. This is the idea that if a person follows a life trajectory that does three key things, they'll avoid poverty. Number one, if they graduate high school, doesn't matter so much about their GPAs, their grades, just finish high school. Number two, have a job. Again, doesn't matter what job, have a job, any job. And number three, get married before you have kids. If you do those three things, you've got a 97% chance of avoiding poverty. And even if you are in poverty for that 3% of the time, it'll probably only be fleeting. It'll be a transitionary, temporary thing in early life. So talk a little bit about success sequences. What does it mean in terms of public policy?
To me, it means that we grapple with this question of poverty, and everyone talks about how can we grow this government program over here, how can we do this new thing with taxpayer dollars, and the solution to poverty is actually one that's pretty common sense, and it's making good choices. That's really what the success sequence is. It's making good choices. And so I've pointed out that the success sequence is backed up by data produced by the Brookings Institution. I've noticed that some liberal reporters will come up and they'll say, well, you can't expect everyone to wait until marriage before they have kids. And my reply to that is, yes, I can.
Why not?
Yes, I can. These are choices.
Yeah.
No one forces you to have a baby before you get married. I recognize that people make mistakes, and that happens in life. We're all human. We're all sinners. We all fall short of the glory of God. We have to try. We have to do our best. But these are choices that people make for the most part. I went to a very rural public high school. I graduated with about 122 folks. Almost everybody in that 122 class had the ability to graduate high school if you wanted to. You could try and you could, or you could not try and you would fail. Almost everybody in that entire high school class could go get some job, and everybody can make the choice to not have a baby before they get married. So these are choices that we as humans make. And I think when we say, well, the government can't expect everybody to make good choices. No, we should. We as a society should expect people to make good choices. And my point is, if we don't get young people making better choices, we are going to wake up and we're still going to be last in all of the worst rankings. Right now, according to the most recent federal data, 54% of babies born in Mississippi are born to unwed mothers. 54%. That should knock you out of your chair when you hear a statistic like that. It should be no surprise later on that if half of the babies in Mississippi are born to unwed mothers, we have a huge prison population. We have a huge population dependent on government. We have a huge population that has all sorts of problems later down the line.
Very similar portion of the population have chosen not to take part in the workforce.
It's amazing. 54% of babies born outside of a marriage, and then you look forward in life, like 53% of adults right now are not in the labor force. Crazy how those two things are correlated. So that's what we have to get a handle on. We have to help our kids make better decisions.
But here's the thing. If you then say, right, okay, let's teach the success sequence. Let's say to every kid in high school, do these three things and your life will be good. I'm skeptical that I think when people talk about the success sequence, what they're doing is they're observing the fact that people who get their act together in life, people who know how to behave conscientiously, people who know how to delay gratification, people who can exercise self-control, people who basically can spend Sunday evening getting ready for Monday morning, if I can put it like that.
Yep.
People like that generally do those three things, and they also generally avoid poverty because that's the kind of person they are. Do you think it's as simple as just teaching the success sequence?
I don't. I think you have to pair it with other things. I think that's a great point. So you may say to a young person, you need to make good choices in life. And the success sequence would describe some of those good choices. Well, that's step one. Somebody, some adult needs to be telling that kid what good choices look like, especially if they don't have another adult in their life doing that. But your point is well taken that, well, what if we're telling that to a kid who hasn't been taught self-control or goal setting or self-regulation? Are they going to listen? Well, one, we got to tell them the message, but two, I think we have to do a better job of putting mentors in their lives. So this is another example of something that has proven to work here in Jackson, Mississippi. One of the rare programs at Jackson Public Schools that's worked well is the high school military program, JROTC. When you look at the kids that go into this program, they effectively get taken by a military veteran who becomes a mentor to them, and often that veteran becomes another parent for them. And a big part of that program is teaching kids self-regulation, how to set goals, how to make good choices, teaching them day by day how to do that. Sometimes how to put on their clothes, look somebody in the eye, shake their hand, show up on time. So I think you have to pair all those things together to get kids to the place where they are making these good choices. And my point is, if we don't do that, if we don't start early in a person's life, you can have all the workforce training programs you want, you can have all of the big government programs you want trying to help adults. The data show that government programs that try to help adults get out of poverty have a terrible return on investment. The data show that money spent on kids to try to get them on the right life path, much better ROI. So that's my point, is that we need to focus on helping kids make good decisions so that they lead a productive life, not giving them money later on.
Now, on a more cheerful note, Ole Miss, University of Mississippi, has just announced that they are getting rid of their DEI department.
Right.
Is this great news? Is this a win for you? I mean, I know you've been campaigning to get rid of this diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda, very divisive idea. Tell us a little bit about it. Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing to get rid of it, and tell us whether you think this marks your triumphant victory.
I would say that they are allegedly getting rid of their DEI department. That's a word we use a lot in press releases. This person was arrested and allegedly did a thing. We'll see if they actually downsize any staff, move any money.
Well, the old head of the old department is going to be running the new office. New office.
It's called Opportunity and something and something, right? So my concern is the name on the wall of the office has changed, but that the policies have not changed. So backing up one click, I started pointing out a couple of years ago that taxpayers were spending millions and millions of dollars on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion at our universities, and some of the expenditures were just absurd. So, for example, at Ole Miss, since we're talking about my alma mater, Ole Miss, they have over 20 staffers dedicated to DEI. The head staffer gets paid more money than the governor and the lieutenant governor of Mississippi combined. They spend money on programs like equity-based preschool training in yoga, which makes no sense to me at all. They put on seminars where they teach students about the evils of whiteness, whatever that is to them. And so these are the kinds of expenditures and programs that I think that taxpayers in Mississippi don't like. And so I've pointed this out repeatedly over the course of the past 2 years. Unfortunately, bills to kill DEI spending have been killed quickly in the Mississippi legislature on the state Senate side.
In the Senate, in particular.
In the Senate side, that's right.
Senate leadership's killed these bills.
So because of that, now you see these universities responding to some of the public pressure by voluntarily shutting down their DEI offices. Let me tell you what shutting down a DEI office ought to look like. In North Carolina, they shut down their DEI offices. They took the money from the DEI offices and they reallocated that money to campus police at their universities. That's what it ought to look like. Campus police actually makes students' lives safer and better. Here, my concern is that they're changing the words on the front of the office. And the reason I believe that or have that concern is that one of the administrators at the University of Southern Mississippi literally said the quiet part out loud. They said, oh, this is just changing the name. We're not making any substantive changes here. It's just changing the name. So I worry that we're going to wake up in a year and a lot of the same programs, a lot of the same things that they were doing, the same staff that they were spending money on, all of that will be the same.
I mean, the University of Mississippi's old DEI department, which they've just announced, has been overseeing a program called Pathways to Equity.
Yep.
And actually what that does, it sounds innocuous, but it makes everything in the university, every aspect of the university, not just the curriculum, but everything about the university, run through the prism of intersectional identity.
Yep.
And it basically, it teaches young Mississippians to see themselves not as individuals in charge of their own destiny, but as victims based on their immutable characteristics. It's a really profoundly toxic ideology. Now, if Glenn Boyce, the Chancellor, was really going to get rid of DEI, I would expect to see a commitment to get rid of all notion of equity and instead commit to equality. There's none of that. Do you think that maybe one way of looking at this is that the Senate leadership has been a roadblock to conservative reform on this? There's a sense that the Senate leadership is weak. It's certainly tried and failed to block school funding reform. There's an element of, you might say, lame duck to it. And that perhaps the university power brokers sense this, their lobbyists sense this, and they realise that if they don't preempt and deflect, they're going to end up with legislation.
Yep, that's exactly what I think is happening. Yep. The oldest trick in government is when you go to a government bureaucrat somewhere and you say, you guys are doing this wrong, and you need to change this. What they want to be able to say back to you is, we already changed it. Don't worry about it. We already did.
It used to be like that, but now it's different.
It used to be like that, but you're right, and we changed it. Please go away. And that is the ultimate fallback tactic of most people in government when you catch them doing something with taxpayer money that you don't like. And I'm not that easily fooled after 6 years as state auditor. I've seen that pattern enough. I know how much waste we have in state government, and so I'm not going to take my eye off the ball.
We need to double down.
We need to double down. We need to keep looking to see how we're spending, how government is spending taxpayer dollars. And I say this as the father of 3 kids. I mean, my kids are 5, 3, and 1, so they're not even close to college age yet. But I would love it if they attended a Mississippi public university. I did, and I thought it was a great experience. But I don't want to raise my kids to believe that they should treat every person the same, regardless of the color of their skin, only to have them go to a Mississippi public university and have them brainwashed to believe the exact opposite. And I certainly don't want to be the one who's paying for the brainwashing at the end of the day either. So that's why I, as auditor, am dedicated to continuing to look at this. But as a father, more importantly, I think we need to keep working on this.
I think you'll have mass support for that. I think so.
Yeah.
Shad, thank you so much for coming in. I
Thanks
really
for
appreciate
having
it.
me, man.
Wonderful.